Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Tuesday, October 3rd at 10 a.m. and we are here today to resume the hearing in docket number 2023-15-E. This docket concerns Dominion Energy South Carolina's 2023 avoided cost proceeding. I think we started this matter in July, I think it was. Could be wrong on the date, or the month. But we are here today to hear from and receive the Commission's third-party independent consultants report and then rebuttal testimony from Dominion to that report. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Carol Lee Williams. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I note that Vice Chair Powers is recused for this portion of the hearing as he was on sick leave during the first part of the hearing and therefore not participating in the continuation of the hearing. Let's take appearances. Excuse me. Let me recognize Staff Counsel to read the docket, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Commissioners and parties. Madam Chair, I believe you covered most of this, but we are here today for the proceeding in docket number 2023-15-E regarding Dominion Energy South Carolina, Inc.'s 2023 avoided cost proceeding pursuant to South Carolina Code Annotated Section 58-41-20A. The proceeding has been scheduled for today, October 3rd, 2023. I believe all parties participating in this matter are available and the docket is in order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mosier. At this point, we're only going to take appearances of the parties. Who's representing Dominion Energy South Carolina?
Good morning, Chair Belser and members of the Commission. I'm Chad Burgess. I'm in-house corporate counsel for the company, and with me today is Michael Anselmo, who is with the law firm of McGuire Woods and serves as the company's outside counsel. It's a pleasure to appear before you today, and we look forward to the resuming of this proceeding. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burgess. I note that Carolina's Clean Energy Business Association has asked to be excused today, and that request has been granted. Also note that South Carolina Coastal Conservation League and Southern Alliance for Clean Energy has asked to be excused today, and that request has been granted. I think both of those were granted by a standing hearing officer directive. And who is representing the Office of Regulatory Staff?
Good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Chad Torrey on behalf of ORS.
Good morning, Mr. Torrey.
Good morning.
Thank you. And do we have Mr. Goulding with London Economics International? Is he on the line?
Yes, I am.
Good morning. We'll get to you in just a moment, Mr. Goulding. We've got a preliminary matter we need to deal with, I think. Parties, I am aware that there has been a motion to strike portions of LEI's report. The independent consultant has filed a response, and I believe Dominion has also filed a reply. We will rule on this in the final order, as allowed by regulation. Commission is aware that they can give it what weight or any weight, no weight, some weight in their discussions, but we will rule on the motion in the final order. And I'm not planning to take oral arguments on this morning. And so with that, are we ready to begin?
Chair Belser, I do have one sort of question, perhaps administrative matter, in addition to what you just discussed. We noticed there was a sheet left on the tables with, I don't know if this was the order of the day proposed by, or if it was just who's going to be here. But
we call that our cast of characters, and it's done by some administrative folks, and it is not the order of the day.
Thank you.
The order of the day was we will hear from the Commission's independent third-party consultant, and then we will hear rebuttal from Dominion. Does that clarify?
Yep, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything further before we begin with testimony? Okay, Mr. Goulding, we'll come back to you now. Good morning. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, ma'am.
I'm going to ask you to raise your right hand, and I'm going to give you the oath to swear you in, please. Do you solemnly affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I so affirm.
Thank you, Mr. Goulding. Mr. Goulding, as you're the Commission's independent third party, there's no lawyer here to kind of guide you through a summary or rebuttal, so I would ask you to just proceed and give us a summary of your report, and then you'll be subject to cross-examination by the parties.
Thank you. May I just ask a question in terms of rebuttal? As I give my summary, is it also useful for me to give a response to what we received yesterday, or is Commission Counsel going to provide an opportunity for me to respond to that?
We don't really, no, just go through your report. The rebuttal will, we're not really doing rebuttal on the report. So you just need to summarize your report, give us your findings, your procedures, however you're going to do your summary, and then you don't need to address the rebuttal, but the rebuttal will come in after the report.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for clarifying. My name is A.J. Goulding. I'm the president of London Economics International, LLC, which is a global economic and financial consulting firm specializing in energy and infrastructure. I have over 30 years experience in the energy and power sector, focusing on regulatory and market design issues, mostly associated with the electricity sector. Now, in addition to the previous work in South Carolina with regards to avoided cost calculations, I have advised on electricity regulatory and market design issues in several U.S. states and provinces, as well as worldwide. Examples include regulatory reviews in Kansas, Hawaii, and Indiana. And in Canada, I've been active with regards to regulatory and market design issues in Alberta, Ontario, as well as in several other provinces. I have performed similar work overseas in Asia and the Middle East. In addition to my consulting work, I teach a graduate level course in electricity markets and regulation at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, and I oversee graduate workshops. I've been involved in PURPA-related engagements throughout my career, including working on reviews of PURPA calculations on behalf of both regulators and qualifying facilities. This has involved reviews of avoided costs, as well as an assessment of the associated charges that QFs may face. LAI uses proprietary modeling tools to assess potential market outcomes in North American regions. LAI's pool mod has been used not only in every US region and active Canadian market, but worldwide in Latin America and Asia. LAI used pool mod in this engagement to test bands of reasonableness around proposed avoided cost calculations and associated elements. Now, in this engagement, LAI's mandate includes the following: to evaluate the avoided cost rates, methodologies, terms, calculations, and conditions proposed by the utilities. This includes reviewing all of the filings on the docket management system, including pre-filed testimony, verifying the avoided cost methodology and calculations included in all parties' testimony, filing data requests with the parties, and writing and filing the consultant's independent report. As noted, LAI is the only party to the proceeding that is not represented by legal counsel, and LAI has had no contact with any party in this proceeding, the Commission or its staff, with regards to interpreting its scope or defining topics to cover in its report. We approach this engagement with several touchstones in mind. First is that in any modeling exercise, there is a degree of uncertainty That's driven both by how assumptions are chosen and by the way in which the model processes the inputs. Consequently, LAI believes that it is important to apply a zone of reasonableness around point estimates. This means that LAI did not seek in its modeling to replicate exactly the same number as the applicants, but rather was satisfied if its calculations were within approximately 10% of those presented in the applications. This is the same threshold that LEI used in evaluating avoided costs in the 2021 proceeding. Now, a second touchstone is that settlements influence views as to what is just and reasonable. So from the standpoint of regulatory efficiency, negotiated settlements and the lack of ratepayer interventions are one means of assessing whether the stakeholders themselves regard an outcome as just and reasonable. As such, while LEI has identified areas of divergence between its views and those of the applicants, we largely defer to the settlement as being reasonable. Now, a third touchstone is that the use of public data supports transparency, and that LEI has utilized only publicly available data in its calculations. Where this results in divergences in calculations, LEI has identified the source of the differences among the assumptions. And finally, context matters. We don't believe that calculations can be performed in a vacuum, and understanding developments in a jurisdiction is important as a means of assuring that the calculations are relevant, particularly for those that are addressing longer time periods. Let me turn to LEI's approach. So for each of the calculations, the avoided energy costs, avoided capacity costs, and the VIC, was to deploy both quantitative and qualitative tools to assess whether the proposed values fell within the zone of reasonableness, and acknowledging where a settlement has been reached among the parties. When values fell outside of the zone of reasonableness, LEI examined additional scenarios to explore differences in key drivers. Now, based on the above process, our conclusions are as follows. We found DESC's proposed avoided energy costs to be reasonable. We found DESC's avoided capacity costs to be reasonable. We continue to believe with regards to the VIC that there's a benefit to independent peer review of the calculations, and wish to reiterate that recommendation. While LEI has noted that LEI believes the continuation of the current rate of $1.80 per megawatt hour would be more appropriate as a VIC, LEI also notes that interveners did not raise concerns with regards to the level of VIC in this proceeding, whereas they have in previous proceedings. And that suggests that stakeholders may believe that the calculations are just and reasonable. We also note that there were no material information requests that were not adequately fulfilled by DESC. So that concludes our high-level summary of our report.
Thank you, Mr. Goulding. We'll now look to the parties and commissioners for questions. Dominion Energy, South Carolina.
We have no questions of Mr. Goulding.
Thank you. Mr. Torrey.
No questions.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions for this witness? Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Good morning, Mr. Goulding. Good to
Good
see
morning,
you.
Commissioner.
Appreciate that summary. That was helpful. So, basically it sounds to me like the VIC charge is the biggest kind of an outstanding issue or difference. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And, just looking at the numbers for the three utilities, Dominion's at $2.79, Duke Carolinas is at $1.05, and Duke Progress is at $2.26, and that is pretty wide ranging. And your recommendation was to stick with the current $1.80. I don't really remember much about how the $1.80 was arrived at in the last avoided cost. Do you remember? Is there anything you can tell me about how you felt about the $1.80 and the prior proceeding?
I don't have my testimony in front of me from the prior proceeding, and so I'd be a little bit concerned about inadvertently contradicting myself. I think I should just stop there. I don't feel like I can address that from memory.
Okay, that's fine. And yeah, I mean, I can see your point about that's a wide range, and part of the conversation was about the larger wholesale markets, and I know that's part of the contention here in this thing. So I don't know if I can ask questions about that or not, but nonetheless, I guess I'm going to go there. So help me understand how being a part of one of those bigger markets would, let's just say, cause the number to be somewhat smoothed out or averaged out. If you can go there a little bit.
Sure. So I think that there's a couple of reasons. We've seen in a number of the submissions a reference to geographic diversity. So the larger the territory over which you are dispatching, the more resources you have to offset the unexpected variability of solar, and the same weather conditions are not going to be prevailing across the entire territory. So this means that as you are balancing the system, you may not, in other words, let's suppose you have a smaller system and you have access to a limited number of quick start resources. And you're more likely in that smaller system to run out of quick start resources than you would in a larger region where you may be able to rely on a unit that is, let's say, part loaded, but is, let's say, in what would currently be an adjacent service territory. It may be that adjacent service territory is not yet experiencing the same cloud cover or other conditions that are resulting in the unexpected variability of the solar output. So you're better able to optimize across a larger fleet, and the impact of the specific variability of that single solar plant, not being operated exactly as expected, is muted across the larger service territory.
Okay, Thank you. I appreciate that. That's all I had.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Commissioner Caston?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Mr. Goulding.
Good morning.
Probably going to ask a similar question to Commissioner Thomas, but looking specifically through Mr. Klein's rebuttal. Do you have that by any chance?
It just so happens that I do.
Okay, good. At page 7, and right now looking at lines like 7 through 11, where Mr. Klein notes that, you know, you make no direct criticism of Mr. David's approach. And he basically goes on to say, I think through 9 through 11, that LEI's entire argument in favor of a lower VIC rests solely on the so-called benchmark analysis of neighboring regions. Is that a fair statement?
I don't believe that it is. I also have to say I do object a little bit to the quotation marks that are around the benchmark. Well, it is reasonable to benchmark utilities against those that are in nearby territories while acknowledging the differences between them. So I don't think that there's anything esoteric about the use of the word benchmark that warrants the quotation marks. But in addition to looking at these benchmarks, we also performed some high-level quantitative analysis. Now, I understand that Mr. Klein had a difference of opinion with regards to some of the assumptions that were made or the calculation methods, but our purpose was not to perform an entire VIC analysis, but rather to examine whether, as we ran through several scenarios, whether we could come up with something that was close to the number that was proposed. And if we had, I think that we would have said, yes, we're comfortable with the number proposed, with the $2.79. Our analysis was unable to substantiate that. And I think the very questions that Mr. Klein raises, for example, about the assumptions with regards to the flexibility of the fleet, are the very assumptions that would be tested in a peer-reviewed modeling exercise. And you know, we note that there are examples of peer-reviewed modeling exercises that included participation from the national labs, which I found to be quite impressive. And so this process will help in terms of testing the various assumptions so that they become not just company assumptions or the consultant that was hired by the company, but rather assumptions that have been tested through independent peer review.
Okay, thank you. And listen, I'm not trying to push any buttons or cause a cat fight, so that wasn't intended to do that. So here's what I'm gonna try to do and see if you can help me do this. There were 2 or 3 I think, responses that Mr. Klein had in his rebuttal testimony that I'll try to either summarize them or just read them. And what I'd like from you, if you could, is you know, in as fewer words as possible, but whatever you need, is if you could tell me if it's a reasonable assumption or reasonable what he's saying or not reasonable. Again, not trying to pick a fight. I'm just, you know, here's what he said. I want to know if you think, well, that's reasonable or not reasonable. Going to the bottom of page 7, looking at, I guess, lines 17 through 21 relative to the question about synchronized, non-synchronized. Because the difference, I'm starting on 18, differences in service territory size, available resources, geographic diversity, dispatch process, total load shapes between DSC, PJM all impact the VIC. PJM is the largest competitive market for electricity in the entire world with a proportionally low amount of solar penetration, making it an inappropriate proxy for the regulated DSC service territory. Is that a reasonable or fair statement by Mr. Klein, and not saying that it's wrong, but is it a reasonable statement or not a reasonable statement?
So characteristics of the service territory matter. And I think that where I would agree with him is that, you know, PJM is, you know, probably in terms of optimization across a large service territory in North America, it's the largest one that you're going to get. And it gives those that are dispatching within PJM access to many more resources than DESC has at its disposal. So from that perspective, I wouldn't find it to be surprising if DESC's VIC was somewhat higher than what's experienced in PJM. I think what concerns me when you look across these various service territories is the challenging question of knowing whether the various operators are optimizing against the resources that they have, that they're making sure that the resources that they do have are as flexible as they can be under commercially reasonable conditions. We have that confidence in PJM because that's what the market drives all the participants to do. So while I agree with the idea that you're not going to be able to match the level of ancillary services costs that you find in as large an integrated market as PJM, I also believe that based on the evidence that we have reviewed, that the $2.79, that the number, yes, $2.79 number proposed appears to be high.
Okay. And going to page 8, relative to weighted averages, lines 8 actually through 19. And the summary of that is, you know, basically Mr. Klein thinks the volatility of these prices alone demonstrates that reserve prices in large competitive electricity market like PJM with hourly and even sub-hourly price formation are not appropriate benchmark for DEC VIC. Similar response? I mean, is it a reasonable comment or statement?
I don't believe so, no. And so I think there's a few reasons. I mean, first of all, we haven't been presented with detailed historical information about the volatility of actual costs incurred by DESC in integrating solar in real time to date. So it would be unsurprising if there was significant volatility in the historical experience of any utility. Secondly, I think all practitioners struggle in how to incorporate data from the past 2 years versus looking at longer term 5-year averages in terms of whether the distortions brought on by the war in Ukraine to underlying fuel prices and the way in which those flowed down through to electricity prices, particularly wholesale prices at particular times. What do you do with that information? Is that normal volatility, and do we include it, or do we exclude it? Now, in the case of the PJM data, the reason that we focused on this most recent data was based on the observations from the market monitor, which noted that PJM made several changes to the primary reserve market effective October 1st, 2022. These included a must-offer requirement and correction of misspecified cost-based offers. By removing opportunities for physical and economic withholding, the changes resulted in clearing increased quantities of available synchronized reserves at competitive prices. So LEI focused on the most recent price data reported by PJM because it reflected what PJM themselves say are a more competitive market environment.
But I guess the figure one that he shows in the table, understanding or acknowledging what you said, from 2020 to 2023, January through June, do you agree that there is, I guess, some volatility there, or some range of numbers? Some were high, some were lower. I mean, is that part correct or incorrect?
But the volatility that you experience historically is an artifact of the fact that you're not actually charging anybody a single price, right? What we're trying to do here is to set a single VIC that will apply to a tranche of contracts. The actual integration cost is going to be volatile, exactly as is represented in the data that was presented. So I don't really see a contradiction, and I don't see volatility in and of itself as a reason to throw out a series of numbers, particularly when the objective is to come up with a smooth charge that will apply across a longer time period.
Okay, final question, if I may. On page 10, looking at lines 10 through 19, and this is relative to solar integration charges and, the southern utilities, which were the two Duke companies, Georgia, and I think Santee Cooper. Starting on 10, excuse me, says the absolute megawatt level of solar penetration is much less relevant than the proportion of solar output relative to load. As the solar proportion of total generation / load increases, the integration cost also increase, typically at an increasing rate. Figures 3 and 4 shows that the peak load in the Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress, and Georgia Power Company service territories are approximately 3 times as high as DESC's peak load. As a result, these territories can accommodate higher levels of solar capacity in megawatt terms with lower integration costs than DESC can, or because the proportion of their load covered by solar output is correspondingly lower. Is that a reasonable statement or comment, or is it not?
Yeah. I think it is one factor to take into account. It is, having more load as well as more generation resources, I think does give you an additional tool to help to manage the unexpected volatility of solar output.
Well, Mr. Goulding, thank you so much. I appreciate you answering my questions, and thank you for appearing.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Commissioners?
Chair Belzer?
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you very much. And my first question is actually going to be to you, Chair Belzer. I wanted to check to see if the pattern will be that we will hear from Mr. Goulding, ask questions from Mr. Goulding regarding his report, hear the rebuttal, and then will we have another opportunity to ask Mr. Goulding questions, or should we ask those now?
You should ask those now.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Good morning, Mr. Goulding. Thank you for being here.
Good morning.
My first question is a real softball of one, but I remember us debating it a lot 2 years ago, and it had to do with the contract term for the avoiding the contract terms being 10 years. Is that something that you all looked at again, or is it a standard that we should accept and move on?
That's an excellent question, and I think it partially depends on your objectives. So the challenge from a developer's perspective is that they're developing a project that has an expected life of 20 to 30 years. It needs to be bankable. They get a 10-year contract. They don't know what the world looks like after those 10 years. And so that is a risk factor that they need to take into account if they're going to develop a project. Whereas in contrast, if you are a utility and you're doing self-build, you're doing it because you're reasonably confident that you're going to recover those costs through the life of the project. So the challenge, of course, obviously PURPA is about avoided costs, and you've made the determination that you're going to look at this on a 10-year basis, but no longer. Now, the project, at the end of the 10 years, they might expect that they might be able to roll into a new 10-year contract, but there's no certainty that they can do it, and they don't know what the price is going to be. Now, the flip side, of course, is that going with, let's say, a 20-year term exposes the ratepayers to risk, right? If you get it wrong, costs go down, avoided costs turn out to be much lower than projected, then the ratepayers are locked into that for a much longer period of time. So the commission is trying to balance those two interests, the interests of the ratepayers and the interests of the developers. My view is that all things being equal, developers would appreciate the opportunity, depending on the pricing, for a contract longer than 10 years. But we can also demonstrate that things are getting built in South Carolina. And so that suggests that, notwithstanding the risk that the development community may see in a 10-year contract, that it is a means to getting things, built. So I think it depends on, if your biggest concern is risk to ratepayers, then I think you're going to be inclined not to go longer than 10 years. I think if your concern is a level playing field with utilities and looking to encourage a diverse portfolio of owners, then you might be inclined to offer longer term contracts.
I appreciate that, and I think my purpose in asking it is solely that with us having this conversation every 2 years, I don't want to assume anything is static, especially in this changing world. And so I appreciate your comments, and I will appreciate learning 2 years from now what those thoughts are, and from whomever is a part of this docket. So thank you. I really liked the way that you all approach and have the zone of reasonableness from the perspective of what you're doing, really reviewing somebody else's intense work. And this is another softballish kind of question. How did you determine the 10%? I probably asked you this 2 years ago, but is it more than gut instinct? I don't think it's wrong. I'm just curious.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And we try to avoid gut instinct when we can. One of the things that we did was to go and look at the forecast error of the national labs, and they do a exhaustive analysis of how accurate their forecasting is, and what the drivers are of the inaccuracies. And certainly the bulk of the forecasting challenges come from forecasting fuel prices. But in our review of the literature with regards to forecast error from the national labs, we felt that the 10% was, the plus minus 10% was consistent with what was seen in the national labs. Could argue for a somewhat wider band based on some of the analysis the national labs have done. We felt that the plus minus 10% was reasonable and consistent in general with what they presented.
Thank you. I want to draw your attention to page 18. And you may recall from our past conversations, I really appreciate how you lay out the vast material that we are given and how you make it easy for us to kind of see everything in a glance, and as well as have the details. And this is a very nice identification of where you agree with the stipulation and where you have different ideas. And I note, as you noted in your summary, that there's a lot of agreement. And I'm not going to talk about the BIC right now, but what I wanted to give you a chance to talk about are the longer term improvements, because I see those as you identified, not explicitly addressed in the stipulation. I also note that you had an additional recommendation that you kind of make in here regarding stakeholders and the BIC process. And so I just want to, we're in a circumstance with the stipulation that is somewhat limiting and a hard decision to make. But I see these as outliers that might inform and improve better avoided cost hearings in the future. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about these long-term improvements.
Sure.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and please, correct me if I go off course or present something that is a bit different than you were expecting.
Well, I'm particularly looking at the coincidence factor notes and the fixed capacity payment. And then I kind of open the door for you to also talk about future BIC studies and stakeholder engagement.
Yeah. So I think that there are a number of issues that were raised by the RS witness that are worthy of further discussion. And so the coincidence factor was one of them. And I think one of the challenges with increasing solar penetration is there is no historical record, right? So much of what we have is based on modeling and expectations, but as we have more and more real world experience, we're going to have a better understanding of what the various conditions are that put the system at risk and how to manage that risk. And so I think that 2 years is a relatively short time frame, and when we see agreements to discuss, it would be nice to see pretty early on some process associated with those agreements to discuss. It's human nature that we all have lots of competing priorities. Our lives are driven by deadlines, and that if we don't have a process schedule, everything gets crammed into the back end of the period that you have available to do it. And so I think from our perspective, these issues that were raised are worthy of additional discussion. And it would be good if there were sufficient time allotted to exploring those issues prior to the next proceeding. As you know, with regards to the fixed capacity payment with performance requirements, we've taken a different view from the RS witness in that we believe that attaching additional payments to the periods of time when you most expect the system to be at stress is the best way of aligning incentives. The problem is that, the way that we're doing it now, we're making assumptions. I shouldn't say we, I should say in the system that's been proposed, we've identified key hours, right? We've said, okay, these are the hours where we expect there to be system stress. This is where we're going to allocate all of our capacity payments. And that's great if we were right about when the hours of system stress were, right? Now, the alternative approach is, as was suggested, this idea that you pay a fixed capacity payment, and then you go back after the fact and you say, okay, here were the hours of system stress, you didn't show up, and so we're going to claw back some portion of that payment. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but it is administratively challenging and also increases uncertainty from the standpoint of the generators themselves. So I think this issue as well is worthy of further discussion over the next 2-year time period. Our opinion is better off trying to identify the hours of stress in advance and putting the payments on those hours. And if the generator doesn't show up, they don't get paid. But there's challenges both with trying to identify the hours before, and there's challenges administratively if you're saying we're going to do this after the fact. So those are the trade-offs that I think should be part of the discussion with regards to a fixed capacity payment if you were to have those discussions in the next 2 years.
Are there best management practices or rules of thumb or comparable states that we should be looking to with regard to considering the idea of performance requirements?
I think there are a diverse set of arrangements. The concept of the fixed capacity payment is adapted from wholesale markets. And over time in the wholesale markets, the performance requirements on the capacity payment have ratcheted up, to the point where there are significant financial consequences for units that don't show up. But those market designs are generally for larger units and quite sophisticated market participants. And it's true that the average QF size in some jurisdictions has been increasing, subject to the limitations under PURPA. But I think best practice would be to consider the administrative challenges along with the economic efficiency that is associated with it. I mean, I think that you have pretty strong performance requirements right now in the way that this is structured. If you don't show up on an hour that has been designated as being a peak hour, you're not going to get a capacity payment. That really, drives a resource, if it's within their physical capabilities, to be available in those hours. But look across 50 states, what South Carolina is doing is not unusual. but there are also instances where you do see the fixed capacity payment.
Thank you. And do you want to add anything with regard to a stakeholder process for a BIC, a new BIC study?
Yeah.
And I'm referring to what you said 2 years ago and the process you referred to that Duke underwent. And I'm thinking about all the testimony associated with the BIC number and, you know, how do we avoid this divergence of thought?
The Duke process involving peer review, I think is a solid one. I think there's a couple of questions that come to mind, and those are, okay, would you need to do this every 2 years? How do you balance regulatory efficiency against the desire to have a well-vetted VIC number? I think the way that I would go is to assemble a panel of reviewers, of experts, and the applicant can sort of take the initiative there as long as they're sort of qualified independent experts. And I would ask the experts to review and test the key proposed assumptions, ask questions, vet the model that's used. There's no particular magic with regards to which model you use as long as you understand its benefits and limitations. And so that's something that the experts can opine on. And then whoever the vendor is that's actually performing the study would go about their business using these vetted assumptions. And then the experts could comment if they saw anything anomalous about the results, given the assumptions that had been chosen. But I think we always need to make sure that the process doesn't overwhelm the question that we're trying to examine. From my perspective, ideally, you would have a separate review report that would come from the experts that said, hey, we raised these issues, they were addressed or not addressed, here's how important we think they are, and we sign off on the overall process as having been independent. And the types of questions that I think need to be tested in any analysis like this are things like the role of battery storage and the timing of its implementation, right? Should that be 1 hour storage, 4 hour storage? How do we address that? Questions about, you have a fleet of simple cycle gas turbines, I'm just as a hypothetical, right? And maybe those are getting older, right? What's the appropriate level of flexibility consistent with good utility practice that we should expect of the utility, right? In other words, should we just take the utility's historical information and say, this is the way that these units should be performing? Or should we test that a little bit? Another issue that's been raised is whether solar itself can provide, through curtailment, a means of managing the costs of solar integration. And as has been noted, that very much depends upon the contract structure that exists for those resources. The fourth issue that I would look at is the role of demand response. So these are all questions that I think the experts would want to test, ask questions, and then say, yes, these are all within our independent view, reasonable assumptions. This is a reasonable model to use, and the results that came out were appropriate.
So based on that, I hear you saying maybe 2 years from now is not the right time to do this, but hey, we recommended it 2 years ago. And that's more from a kind of a cost efficiency perspective. Am I hearing you right?
I think that what I would say is I would start doing it now or close to now, like within the next 6 months, I would start the process for the next proceeding. I would not necessarily advocate for doing this every 2 years. Maybe it's something you would do every 4 years, because the marginal value of the additional review is limited, within a 2-year period. So I think I would alternate proceedings for doing this, but I would do it. I would kick off the process in the next 6 months, since you've only got 2 years until the next proceeding.
Thank you. So I listened to your summary very carefully, and I actually had some similar thoughts to you about interveners not participating, and as it relates to the number that is proposed for the VIC charge. And I appreciate your stating that. Sorry, I'm just looking over my notes and trying to think of what's most important to ask right now. And I do have a number of other questions that I may wait and get over my coughing fit for. So I think I'll stop for now and let another commissioner ask, and I may have other additional questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioners, questions for Mr. Goulding?
Could I ask one follow-up?
Commissioner Caston?
Mr. Goulding, thank you. Listening to that question and answer, let me just ask this. If the VIC is too low, who benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, if the VIC is too low, what we are looking at is a benefit to the developers, or to the QF, I guess I should say, just to be clear about what kind of developers we're talking about. So, if we set it, dramatically too low, always understanding that it's challenging to determine, what the exact number should be. But if it is too low, we are benefiting the QFs.
Okay, so if it's too low, we're benefiting the QFs. Ultimately, if I'm understanding all this correctly, the company, they're not going to lose either way, whether it's high or low, correct? Ultimately, doesn't the customer end up paying whether it's too high or too low?
Yes, that's correct. If it's too high, you're going to have fewer. It's going to impact the economics of the QFs, and potentially fewer of them will choose to locate in South Carolina, which has some long-term implications for cost and competitiveness. But in either circumstance, there may be some timing issues, but the company would not be on the hook, so to speak.
Okay. And relative to the QF, you're not implying that it's somehow the commission's role to benefit or not benefit the QF. Okay.
Not at all. I think we had in some of the proceedings a discussion of equivalence, that the objective is to make the customer indifferent to whether QF or the company, the applicant, is providing new capacity.
Got it. So that indifference would be if it's too low, it's not indifferent. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Goulding. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Commissioners, questions for Mr. Goulding?
Chair Belzer?
Commissioner Williams?
Thank you. I appreciate that exchange because it helped me focus on, I think, two remaining questions. Mr. Goulding, would you talk about VIX and their ability to go up or down? For example, if we were to choose the amount identified in the stipulation, but data in 2 years suggested it could come down to kind of reflect what the conversation you just had with Commissioner Caston, so that the number really is reflective of the cost. And does that happen? Is it doable?
So I'm very mindful of not making any legal statements here.
I'm
but
really asking about precedents, and well, not precedents. I'm examples from other dockets from other states that are dealing with this.
Yeah. So the way that I understand the process from a South Carolina perspective is that the VIC is applicable to a tranche of contracts for the life of those contracts. Now, 2 years from now, you could set the VIC higher or lower based on whatever considerations were the case at the time. But that would apply to the next tranche of contracts. Mm-hmm. And with regards to existing contracts, if again we think about it from the developer's perspective, at least they know what it is, right? Once it's set, they will have to manage around it. So yes, you could set something up that was formulaic. You could set something up that was, simply reset every 2 years. That would increase the probability that the VIC was closer to the true number over, let's say, a 10-year period, because you'd have, 5 different 2-year VICs. But the flip side of that is that it is volatile and something that is more difficult for the developer to put into their pro formas, show to their banks, show to their equity investors. So I think that you have to think carefully before you go to something that would be formulaic or change every 2 years in an existing set of contracts. Right now, where you are is every 2 years you're setting the VIC for the next tranche of contracts, and that may be higher or lower than what you did for the previous tranche of contracts. And yes, we see the possibility of setting a formulaic VIC or one that changes from proceeding to proceeding. I'm not certain that the developer community would welcome that.
I appreciate the thoroughness of how you answered that, and also dealt with a little bit of my naivete and bringing me back up to speed in terms of the tranches. I have one more question, and it is from page 47 of your report. And you probably don't need it, but what I read in the top paragraph is that under all scenarios, LEI's results suggest lower VIC values than the $2.79 per megawatt hour proposed by Dominion. What do we have your results in what you've given us in terms of lower numbers, and what were they? Or am I taking that too literally?
So we had filed those numbers in a confidential file in response to an IR. So I believe you would have them available to you. We do have a few caveats that we want to make sure that folks are aware of, in that, as we've said, we were not performing a full VIC, right? If we were performing a full VIC, we would have run many, many, many more scenarios. We would have performed different permutations of the calculations, including the approach that we used, some of the approaches that Mr. Klein mentions. But that was not the purpose of our analysis. The purpose of our analysis was to say, okay, let's look at this on a high level, doing some quantitative modeling. And given that, are we getting to $2.79? Then the next question was, well, are we getting to within 10% of $2.79? And unfortunately, we were not. And so, we looked at this and said, well, on the one hand, there's a stipulation, and we think that's obviously an important consideration. On the other hand, we're not getting to $2.79. And we believe that were we to do a full VIC study, it is possible that we would not get to within 10% of the $2.79 number, which is why we then said, okay, rather than adding other numbers to the record, we have a recommendation out there of sticking with the $1.80. And we believe that it's more responsible for us to recommend staying with the $1.80 than to throw a bunch of additional numbers in here and then prolong the record, especially given that our objective was to test the numbers rather than to present a single new number.
I'll ask you one more question, and it really, it's a little bit unclear to me how this process will unfold. So is there anything that you want to comment on with regard to Mr. Klein's? Yeah, the testimony we received yesterday. I think it was yesterday.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. And some of this we've touched on already, so I don't think that we necessarily need to talk more about PJM. As I said, I believe that what you're looking at with PJM is probably the best that you can do with regards to the level of VIC, and it would be challenging to get numbers as low as PJM's in these individual service territories, but it is likely that further optimization is possible. Now, when I turn to this question of looking at the various utilities in nearby service territories, one of the things that we want to highlight is the information that was presented by Mr. Klein with regards to Santee Cooper is incomplete. And what we would highlight is that in Santee Cooper's 2023 IRP, the utility presents a table that happens to be table 15 in the Santee Cooper 2023 IRP that says that Santee Cooper, based on the results of the Astrape study, Santee Cooper utilized the following assumptions for the cost of integration when performing portfolio optimization in all years. So the assertion that these numbers were cherry-picked or they were not presented appropriately, we believe is incorrect. So if you go to table 15 in Santee Cooper's IRP, there's assumed solar and wind integration cost. There's a tranche of 1,000 to 1,500 megawatts, and that number is the $1.61, which was referenced. So we do believe that regional benchmarks provide a useful understanding of the potential range of reasonable values for a VIC. And we do believe that what we presented for Santee Cooper is appropriate. Now, turning to the review of LEI's pool mod analysis, as we've noted, the work that we did was to assess independently whether we could support the $2.79 based on our own modeling. It was not to perform a VIC study using the number of scenarios that would be required. Doing that, we felt would just add costs to ratepayers and be in excess of the budget that is allocated to this proceeding. Nonetheless, when we did that analysis, we found that there were a range of values that were less than 90% of the $2.79 level. Now, Mr. Klein goes through and identifies various assumptions that were made that he disagrees with. Ultimately, we believe that those assumptions would be the subject for additional scenarios, and in some cases would not result in significant differences in the calculations. But overall, we believe that his critique misunderstands the objective of the work that we did, and also shows the importance of peer review of input assumptions.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience and letting me hop back on and ask more questions. That's all for me, Chair Belzer.
Commissioners, anything further for the witness? Mr. Goulding, thank you very much for your testimony this morning and for your report. We appreciate the work that you've put into this. And just a moment.
I think at the beginning of the hearing, the commission might have inadvertently overlooked admitting the report into evidence.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
I appreciate that. Let me just lay that foundation, Mr. Goulding. Mr. Goulding, on September 12th, did LEI file with the commission its independent report on Dominion Energy South Carolina's 2023 avoided cost proceeding?
Yes.
And,
yes, we did.
Well, I think the report is dated September 11th, but it's got a file date of, or accepted for processing, so it may have been on the 11th, but it was put on the DMS on September 12th, I think. And that is, that report consisted of, I think, 55 pages, and that is the report that LEI prepared. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you were the supervisor of that report?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, I don't think there'll be an objection, but we will admit LEI's report as the next hearing exhibit, and I don't know that number, but it'll be the sequential number in the hearing. So, thank you. Mr. Goulding, again, thank you for your report, for your testimony today, and you may stand down as a witness. You're welcome to continue listening to the proceeding.
Thank you so much.
We've been going about an hour and a half, and before we get into the rebuttal witnesses, why don't we take a 15-minute break, please? We will return at 11:40. Thank you. Good morning, and we are back at the Public Service Commission for continuation of docket number 2023-15E, Dominion Energy South Carolina's 2023 avoided cost proceeding. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Caston, Chair Belser. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams. There we go. When we left off, we had accepted the LEI report into evidence. It will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit number 7 and received into the evidence of this case. We've concluded with the presentation of the LEI report. We now recognize Dominion Energy for rebuttal testimonies. Mr. Anselmo.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. We call Jim Neely and Mike Klein to the stand as a panel.
Would you please raise your right hands? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you'll give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Neely, could you please state your full name for the record?
James Neely.
And who are you employed and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Dominion Energy Services as the Energy Market Strategic Advisor.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared under your direction 4 pages of pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report?
Yes, I did.
And if I asked you all the questions in that testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Chair Belzer, I move Mr. Neely's pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report be entered into the record as given orally from the stand.
Mr. Neely's pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report will be entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Thank you. And Mr. Neely, did you prepare a summary of your testimony?
Yes, I did.
Could you present it to the commission, please?
Yes, I will. Good morning, Chair Belzer and Commissioners. My rebuttal testimony addresses the avoided cost conclusions reached in the LEI report. After review of the company's avoided cost methodology, LEI supported and confirmed 1. The company's avoided energy costs and avoided capacity cost calculations. 2. The company's time of production periods used in calculating the avoided energy cost. 3. The company's position that capacity should not be valued prior to an identified capacity need. And finally, the company's position that use of net capacity costs would be inappropriate under the Commission's approved methodology. This concludes my summary. Lucas.
Michael Anson Klein.
Thank you. And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
I work for Guidehouse as an associate director in the power capital markets practice.
And did you prepare or cause to be prepared under your direction 21 pages of pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report?
Yes.
And if I asked you all the questions in that testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
And Mr. Klein, did your testimony include an exhibit labeled as MAK-1?
Yes.
Chair Belzer, I move that Mr. Klein's pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report and exhibit MAK-1 be entered into the record.
Mr. Klein's pre-filed rebuttal testimony to the LEI report will be entered into the record as if given from the stand, and Mr. Klein's exhibit that accompanied his pre-filed testimony and marked as MAK-1 will be marked for identification as hearing exhibit 8 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you. And Mr. Klein, did you prepare a summary of your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Could you present it to the commission?
Yes. Good morning, Chair Belzer and Commissioners. My rebuttal testimony presents the company's response to certain issues raised regarding the VIC in the report filed by LEI. LEI did not conduct a full VIC study, nor did LEI directly offer any criticism of the approach used by Guidehouse. Instead, LEI reviewed the company's VIC through comparison to outlier PJAM ancillary service prices and inapplicable solar integration costs estimated by other utilities. LEI also mentions running its own illustrative solar integration analysis, but notably, LEI does not provide any resulting alternate value for the VIC. LEI's approach is flawed for several critical reasons. First, a comparison of PJM, the world's largest competitive electricity market, with only 6 gigawatts of solar generation, to the company's service territory is not an apples-to-apples comparison, cannot justify the appropriate VIC for DESC, and is extremely misleading. Even if PJM prices could be used, LEI understates PJM historical reserve prices by only presenting prices for January through June of 2023, while excluding prices for previous years. The weighted average prices emitted by LEI for synchronized reserve products since PJM exceeded $5 per megawatt hour in 2021 and $10 per megawatt hour in 2022, well above the proposed VIC of $2.79 per megawatt hour. Second, any reliance on solar integration charges from other utilities likewise have no bearing on the company's VIC. Each of the utility systems relied upon by LEI have different characteristics that are not analogous to DESC. Solar integration charges used by neighboring utilities cannot in and of themselves determine the appropriate VIC for DESC. LEI also misuses the solar integration costs from those other utilities. If LEI had properly compared its cited solar tranches to the solar penetration in relation to peak load, it becomes clear that the DESC tranche 1176 to 1575 is a much higher level of solar penetration, over 30% of peak load, than the surrounding utilities. Because of the other utilities' much larger load obligations, the solar tranches LEI presents are not equivalent to DESC's 1176 to 1575 megawatt tranche. The tranche used by LEI are likely commensurate with DESC's previous tranche, or even tranches lower than that. This is critically important because lower solar tranches typically have lower integration costs than higher tranches. Third, LEI's comparison to Santee Cooper is also inappropriate. LEI cites Santee Cooper's 2023 IRP estimates for the solar integration cost at $1.61 per megawatt hour starting in 2029. LEI omits the fact that prior to 2029, Santee Cooper solar integration costs are much higher than the proposed DESC VIC. The Guidehouse analysis of the VIC properly includes costs that will be incurred prior to 2029 and found the majority of solar integration costs occurred prior to 2029. Additionally, LEI focused on Santee Cooper's 1001 to 1500 megawatt tranche rather than its 1501 to 2000 megawatt tranche, which is arguably more comparable to the DESC 1176 to 1575 megawatt tranche as a percentage of peak load. Had LEI analyzed that tranche, Santee Cooper's solar integration charges would be $14.99 per megawatt hour pre-2029 and $4.06 per megawatt hour 2029 forward. In either case, both charges are significantly higher than the company's $2.79 per megawatt hour VIC. Fourth, LEI made several errors in its illustrative solar modeling that artificially depressed the VIC. LEI made errors in the levelization calculations that, when corrected, would value the VIC in excess of $1.80 per megawatt hour and reach as high as $4.83 per megawatt hour. LEI also incorrectly modeled the company's system with only 1,447 megawatts of solar capacity, rather than the correct 1,575 megawatts of solar capacity. Because solar integration costs rise as solar penetration increases, this assumption depressed LEI's estimates of incremental solar integration cost. LEI's assumptions on coal and natural gas capacity flexibility also depressed LEI's estimate of incremental solar integration costs. Finally, LEI modeled an illustrative solar generation profile that varied by month but not within a month. This likely depressed LEI's estimate of incremental solar integration costs, because solar integration costs tend to be disproportionately highest during periods of extreme output volatility. In conclusion, LEI's report does not support a reduction of the agreed-to VIC of $2.79 per megawatt hour. A VIC less than that amount would result in DESC's customers bearing the integration costs rather than the solar developers creating those costs. The $2.79 per megawatt hour VIC argued to in the stipulation is accurate, reasonable, and should be adopted by the Commission. This concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Klein. Chair Belzer, the panel is available for questions from the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Anselmo. Mr. Torrey, I guess based on the stipulation that ORS has no cross, is that correct?
That's correct, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you. Commissioners, questions for this panel? I have a couple of questions, Mr. Klein, and they're going to be really basic, so just to help me a little bit. Why is it that I'm looking at page 10 of your testimony, and on line 12, you state, as solar proportion of total generation load increases, the integration cost also increase. Could you just walk me through that?
Sure. It's pretty simple, and I think I'm going to echo the testimony of Mr. Goulding. In general, as the percentage of intermittent resources of any sort, solar in this case, but this same would apply to wind or hydro, increase relative to a service territory's peak load, and its as a percentage of its total installed capacity, which is highly correlated to its peak load, it becomes more difficult to deal with the volatility associated with forecast error. So, you know, as a really simple example, you can imagine if you had 1 megawatt of solar on your system, there's pretty much always going to be a natural gas combined cycle or a peaker or a coal plant that can move up or down by 1 megawatt. But when you get higher and higher to, 100, 200, 1,000 megawatts, and that becomes a higher percentage of the system's total peak, it becomes more difficult to deal with that uncertainty. There are things you might have to do, such as run inefficient steam units in preparation of expectations of substantial increases or decreases in peak and sell power off system at a loss. You might have to commit units that you otherwise would not want to commit and incur substantial startup costs, wear and tear costs, as well as running them for long periods of time when they would otherwise be inefficient. So it's generally the principle that, as I said, Mr. Goulding himself appears to agree with, which is that the more options a system operator has to deal with uncertainty, the lower those costs will be. And the options are almost without fail in the real world directly correlated to the peak load of a system, for the simple reason that, if you have a 5,000 megawatt peak, you're probably not going to want to build 50,000 megawatts of generation to cover it.
Okay, thank you. And then on page 12, at the top of the page, first 3 lines, you state that the Guidehouse VIX study shows the majority of integration costs for Dominion occur in spring when load is at or near its lowest and solar generation at its highest. Why would that be the majority of the integration cost during that time frame?
So this is where solar as a percentage of peak load rather than peak generation becomes an important issue. And it almost seems counterintuitive, but it is very difficult for operators to deal with system conditions when load is very low, just because, power generators are bulky. Some of them can be hundreds of megawatts, if not even thousands of megawatts, and need to be turned on or off for extended periods of time, including leaving them on for periods of time when they're relatively inefficient compared to other resources, at least on a variable basis. So what you have during these periods in the spring is that the solar forecast error as a percentage of total load is extremely high, making it much more difficult for the system operator to respond to changes in solar output simply by, as I said in my earlier example, ramping up or down a combined cycle. They need to do things such as commit inefficient steam units, potentially for periods of days at a time, when otherwise, absent the solar forecast error, they wouldn't need to do that. And again, it does seem counterintuitive that conditions of low load would create problems, but it's because the low load makes the solar percentage of total load even higher.
And that's because if there's cloud cover or spring storm, bringing on that less efficient, you got to bring on a bigger unit, and it's going to cost more to bring on that unit.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of the costs associated with solar integration involve committing units that you wouldn't otherwise want to commit because they're expensive, they're slow, they're inefficient, just because you may need them to deal with either system uncertainty or even with known variability associated with solar output.
Okay. Thank you very much. Commissioners, questions for this panel? Commissioner Caston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Relative to that response to the last question, I think, which you're asking on page 12, occur in the spring when the load is at or near its lowest and solar generation is at its highest. Is that, would that be the greatest opportunity or time for when curtailment would occur or could occur or need to occur?
I mean, yes, is the short answer to that question. You're most likely to have solar curtailment during periods where you're more likely to have solar curtailment during periods where load is extremely low and solar output is extremely high. If you're referring to whether or not it would also be economically efficient in some of those cases to curtail solar, it's possible. Though under the current conditions that QFs operate under, they would be unlikely to be willing to economically curtail.
Understand. And thank you for the explanation of the other things. No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, any further questions for this panel?
Chair Belzer?
Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Mr. Neely, you won't be surprised, but my questions are for Mr. Klein, but good to see you again. Mr. Klein, in noticing that the increase in the VEC is something like 55%, are there big picture ways to be able to describe why that is so dramatic? Is there something we did 2 years ago that led to such a big increase? Are there things that have happened kind of nationally that have impacted it? Is there a way to answer it at that level?
I mean, I think the primary change is simply that we're looking at a higher solar integration tranche. I believe that 2 years ago, and I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't have this in front of me, but I believe the estimate of the VIC for the tranche that was most equivalent to this tranche provided by Guidehouse was actually a little bit higher than the $2.79 per megawatt hour estimate. So it's really a function of the, pretty much universal fact that for any given system, as you increase the amount of solar on it, all other things being equal, the solar integration costs also increase, and they tend to increase at an increasing rate.
And thank you. That makes sense. And regarding my conversation with Mr. Goulding and from page 47 of his report, where they talk about having in the past recommended a collaborative process where the inputs, the assumptions, and the methodological approach can be the subject of stakeholder consultation and feedback. Does Guidehouse prepare any VIC studies in that manner?
Not that I'm aware of. In principle, I have no objection to the idea of a collaborative process where our inputs are reviewed. I think I would even say that, looking at the pool mod analysis as we did would have had a benefit because we caught a couple of errors in their calculations that, had they been corrected, I think would have rendered it much more illustrative and, it may have induced LEI to run more scenarios as they discussed.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Thomas?
Thank you. So just kind of thinking ahead a little bit, there's talk about more and more battery storage in connection with solar. And if that does play out where there is more battery storage connected to solar, how does that relate to what we're talking about here today, if it does?
I'm sorry, is that a question for me or Mr. Neely?
Both of you can jump on it or you can fight over it. It doesn't matter to me.
All right, let me, what we found in the Guidehouse study is that the batteries that we have in the resource plan, the one that we put forth in the IRP, caused the VIC to drop when those batteries came online. So batteries can reduce the VIC. We also include, we already have contracts for 99.5 megawatts of battery, and that was in that study. So the level of batteries that we contracted for are in the study, and they're why the number is 279, and the comparable tranche 2 years ago would have been $4.64 for this comparable tranche. So those batteries have reduced it, and a significant reason why it's 279 and not 464.
I would just add that the effects of these batteries are taken into account in our calculation, which is a 10-year levelized calculation. Earlier, in response to Chair Belser's question, I mentioned that, or it may have been actually, I'm sorry, in my summary, that we found relatively little solar integration costs post-2029. That's because of the additional battery flexibility. Now the flip side is batteries can cost somewhere in the neighborhood of, depending on the duration, but say you're talking about 4-hour batteries, even after taking into account IRA subsidies, they might be $1,300, $1,400, $1,500 a megawatt. I'm sorry, a kilowatt. Which for say like a 400 megawatt battery facility might translate into $500 million. And they don't last as long as traditional generation. I mean, nobody really knows how long they'll last, but generally, 20 years would be a high-end estimate for the lifespan of a battery. I think 10 to 15 years is more common in the industry.
May I ask a clarification, Commissioner? Mr. Klein, when you were just estimating the cost of that battery, did you say $500,000 or $500 million?
Billion with a B.
I just want to make sure that was clear. Thank you.
All right, thanks. I appreciate that. That's all I have.
Commissioner Caston?
Thank you. Somewhere I saw it. I don't know if in one of the hearings or something coming up, but there was, relative to the batteries, and I think relative to peaking, and I'm trying to think how it's described. I understood it when I read it. I'm trying to get my head around it again relative to this, and I'm not sure if it would be related. But there was a drop off, or I guess a benefit cost drop off after a certain amount, maybe that initial battery storage that took care of that X amount of peak, and then every storage after that. I don't know if benefit cost is the correct terminology, but really dropped off. Does
that's generally accurate. It's sort of the flip side of, as you increase solar penetration, all things being equal, integration costs tend to increase at an increasing rate. As you increase the amount of battery storage on a system, the benefits tend to decrease at an increasing rate. So, it's kind of the classic economist diminishing marginal returns. Every additional megawatt of battery storage is going to get you less benefits than the previous one.
Okay. That, like I say, it made sense when I read it, and that makes sense. And I guess if the cost, well, I guess even if the cost of the batteries and the life of them changes. I guess it could modify that, but the benefit cost or the marginal help would still be in that.
Yeah, I mean, the costs of battery declining over time might affect your decision about how many megawatts of battery storage to build, but you're correct. I mean, unless there were some sort of technological improvement in their operations, you wouldn't expect the benefits to increase with each additional megawatt.
All right. Thank you a lot, Mr. Klein. Thank you. Mr. Neely, I have nothing. Thank you.
Commissioners, anything further? Hearing none. Mr. Anselmo, any redirect?
No redirect.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today and for being here. You may stand down. Mr. Anselmo, anything further?
That concludes the company's rebuttal case.
Thank you. With that, we will close this proceeding, and I know that we are missing some parties, but we need to talk about proposed orders at some point. So I think our staff attorney will send out an email to all the parties about proposed orders. And with that, thank you very much for your participation, your presentations. We are adjourned. Thank you.